I think there were a few things that were happening simultaneously that made it happen when it did. I mean, one was the obvious thing. If you go to work at a law firm from law school, you find very quickly that lots of lawyers spend a lot of their time doing things that didn't have anything to do with the 3 years of education they got. So that's one. Another was that, and Paul may elaborate on this, but this was a period of change socially, and more women who used to go into elementary education and so on were now looking for other types of careers, other opportunities in the working world. And the last, and really in many respects, the most critical of all of these was salaries started changing in law firms. So for years and years and years, young lawyers got paid very, very little, and they were apprentices, really. When I started, the starting salary was $7,800 a year, 1966. The starting salary, when I got out of college, a lot earlier, because I went to law school late, was about $7,000. So I'm assuming starting salaries were no different than what young lawyers were getting. Suddenly, it started with Cravath in New York. They started raising salaries significantly, doubling them. And suddenly there was a big spread, and it made now economic sense to have somebody else do some of these things that lawyers used to do. At least that's what it seemed to us.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that happened suddenly. I mean, I was a first-year lawyer at a large Philadelphia firm. Dan and I were at the same firm. And I know whatever I started at, it began with a 7. So it had to be the same 7,800. And I was looking to buy a house and concluded that to really afford it, I had to be making $15,000 a year. And within 3 or 4 months after I started work, Cravath increased the starting salary for their firm in New York from about $8,500 to $15,000. I mean, so it was a dramatic jump. And all of a sudden, I was called into a meeting with the managing partner and all the associates. And he announced to us that the starting salary at Wolf Block, which is where we were, was going to jump to $13,500. And that I was therefore immediately moved up to $13,500. I was only $1,500 from being able to afford the house. So it happened fast. There were a lot of things that happened fast around that time. And I do remember that Dan and I were kind of sitting around. We were working in a space that wasn't, it was probably twice the size of this room. And we each had little offices. It was pre-cubicle days. We had little offices with walls that did not go up to the ceiling. There were 4 of us in there, 2 on one side of the room, two on the other, and 4 secretaries in the middle who were doing overflow work for partners. We had no secretaries. It was somewhat impossible to work, so we sat around and talked a lot. And I remember it was a time when a lot of young people were making quick money. There were a lot of investment opportunities, and guys were starting businesses and selling them, and it seemed like we were missing the opportunity to do something in business that might be very lucrative. And we started to talk about, maybe we could start a business of some sort. And one day, Dan said to me, read this article. And he had read an article in the American Bar Journal about a guy who had a small law firm in a small town in Kansas, and he did insurance defense work. And he had decided to hire a lot of his wife's friends, all of whom were college graduates, at a point in their lives when their kids were in school. And they now could go to work part-time. And he had 2 or 3 lawyers in his firm, and he was up to 30 or 40 of these people that he called paralegals. And Dan said to me, what do you think of this? Maybe this is an idea that might make sense. And it dovetails with what he said about things that were happening in law firms that didn't require you to be a lawyer, forming a corporation, doing certain work in the estates and trusts area, and so forth. And you could go right through the various specialties. And we started to talk about, could this work in a law firm? And of course, when they raised the associates to $13,500, whatever they charged for us, which was probably $12 or $15 an hour, went up to $25 an hour. And so it did create this opening for another potential class of person. We had a couple of people at Wolf Block that did some of the work we were thinking about, but there weren't very many of them at other firms. And so the discussion took off from that point. People thought we were nuts, essentially, when we left to do this. The concept of non-lawyers doing lawyer work was met with tremendous resistance by the lawyers. And what we decided we had to do was we had to create the market. So we needed students on the one hand, and we needed jobs for them on the other hand. And so we ultimately developed a business model that was unique in the school business, which was that we would handle the placement of each of our students when they graduated for a fee. And that the tuition would be inexpensive, the fee would be expensive. There wasn't much of a law firm placement business in those days. There were some headhunters, but that was a very strange profession also. I remember meeting one of those headhunters in New York. He contacted us. We met him, and he asked me my name, and I told him, and I asked him his name, and he gave me a name that sounded very weird. And he said, of course, that's not my real name. I said, what do you mean it's not your real name? And he said, oh, we don't use our real names in this business. It was like the flakiest business in the world. So there weren't headhunters. And the concept of getting fees for placing people in law firms was also unique. And because we were doing this, we had to go sell it to the law firms. We had to convince them to do it and then get the students jobs in the law firms. And so on the one hand, we had to educate people. We had to create the courses and so forth. On the other hand, we had to do the sales work. And I just remember sitting there the first day I realized that we were going to have to do this after we had left the law firm and thinking, what have I gotten myself into? I went to law school because I didn't want to have to sell. And now, I've got to somehow sell. And there was a lot of resistance. It was not easy to sell.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Paul and I both hit the road, and we spent a lot of time visiting law firms. I mean, all over. I think there was one more thing that happened with us, at any rate, that was an important decision. We realized that in order to attract students, we had low tuition, as Paul said, but also we promised them a job when they got out. And if we didn't get them a job in a city that was designated in advance, we gave them their tuition back. The idea being, you didn't get the job you came for, we're not going to benefit from this. And that was our policy all the way through. And I think those types of policies helped us get very good quality students. It created a credibility. But in any event, it was the only way we could make this succeed would be, we didn't assume that we would have a big enough market in any one city. So therefore, we had to go nationwide, not all at once, but very quickly. And as a result, we had to recruit students from all over the country, bring them to Philadelphia, and then place them back where they came from, more or less. That was key because, as I said, no single market could have sustained this. I mean, we had a typical corporate course might have 40 people in it. We couldn't get 40 jobs in Philadelphia if our life depended on it.
Couldn't get 40 jobs anywhere, yeah. Just a couple anecdotal stories that I think students watching this would find really interesting. When we started out, we hired a guy, an advertising guy, which was completely new to us. And we sat around first trying to decide, what are we going to call this place? And this guy became the editor of Philadelphia Magazine, by the way, very creative guy named Arthur Spickle. And I remember sitting in a room with Art and Dan and others kicking around names. Now, the guy in Kansas called his people paralegals. The American Bar Association, as a result of what he was doing, had formed a committee to look at this concept. It was a small committee of like 5 people, which this guy was on. He may have even been chairman. And they threw around the term legal assistants. They weren't sure what it all meant. And so we're trying to figure out a name. Eventually somebody in the room says the Institute for Paralegal Training, which is what we ultimately called it. And I still remember Art Spickle looking at us and he said, boys, it's not Kleenex, but it'll probably have to do. You know, you have these memories of little individual things that happened 30-some years ago. We then, you know, we're trying to figure out how do we attract these people. So Art says, well, you have to have focus groups. So there was a place in University City, not affiliated with any of the universities, that did psychological testing, and they did focus groups. And so we hired them, and they put together a panel of women, because we figured it was all going to be women. They were the ones who were having trouble getting jobs. And they put together a couple panels of women. They came from Penn, they came from Drexel, they came probably from Villanova and Bryn Mawr and so forth. And there were maybe 20, 25 in a room, and we were sitting behind a mirrored window. And of course, this, you know, we were lawyers. Everything that was happening, Dan had been in business successfully before, and he knew something about business. I knew nothing about business. And we're sort of watching this, and the guy is, you know, is talking to the women about what this might be about. And he's trying to figure out what could we do to sell these women. And he said, at one point, he said to them, how do you feel about the fact that you'd be working in a law firm and you'd meet young male lawyers, and, you know, they make a good living, they're good, you know, they're a good source of support, as you know, they're real eligible for marriage. This could be a good thing. And we're sitting behind this two-way mirror, and honestly, if there were 20 girls in the room, girls at the time, 18 of them said, who would want to marry a lawyer? They're boring, they work too hard. It was hysterical to watch. So that was not something that we emphasized, you know, in the sales process. I think one of the reasons that we got students was that late in the Vietnam War, there was a deferment given for people that taught. And most of these young ladies were headed for teaching. It was very traditional at that point in time. This was just pre the women's movement really taking off. My class in '67 had 3 women in it. 10 years later, that same class was 40% women probably. And men were applying for teaching jobs to get a deferment. And they were crowding women out from that area. And here was a group of very intelligent women graduating from Penn and Bryn Mawr and Radcliffe and Holyoke and all the best schools in the country, and they had majored in philosophy and history of religion and art, and they couldn't get jobs. And all of a sudden, we show up on the campus, and again, it's an interesting thing because of the feminist movement, because it all happened so fast. We didn't see it at the time. Some of it we saw, some of it you realize later. Our first brochure had a picture on it that went to lawyers. It had a picture, I mean, we looked at thousands of pictures, and Spickle gave us a picture of a woman in silhouette, and she was very cool looking. I mean, she was a dark-haired woman with a flip hairdo, which was perfectly appropriate in those days, with a pencil through her hair. So she looked very businesslike. And I think the brochure said something like, if she could only do half of what we're telling you, something like that, you know, she's worth you hiring. And what was interesting is that over the first few years, the students forced us to change the brochure. First, the pencil came out of her hair, and then she came off the brochure ultimately. So all this was, I mean, it's all intertwined with the women's movement in a very, very interesting way, because probably 80% of the students that came through the school in the first 3 years, which is when we really took off, probably 80% of them today would be MBAs, doctors, lawyers, et cetera. And we had graduates that went on to law school after working in law firms and did very well in many instances.
So talk a little bit about how the school, the early days of the school, and why.
Well, it was in Philadelphia because we were in Philadelphia. It was as simple as that. We weren't going to move. I mean, this was risky enough business, let alone moving. I think we were originally rented some space at 4th and Walnut, And we were there, I guess, for about a year and a half. And the first class was, our recruiting was curtailed because Kent State shooting happened at that point, and campuses were going crazy, and it was, we ended up, this is my recollection, was something like 17, 18 students.
I think it was even less. I would have guessed, you know,
In
I
the
would have guessed 14, but
in a corporate class. Corporate was my specialty, so that's what we did first. And we literally wrote textbooks. And we proceeded to write a lot of textbooks. And Paul was the principal in the real estate course materials, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, running straight down the line. And we got outside writers, people that we knew. Now it turns out that they were the cream of the legal profession, you know, and they were writing chapters for us. But the course materials were, they were a problem because we were producing them at the same time that students were arriving, often a week apart. And it was touch and go, but we always managed to stay ahead. But at any rate, after guess it was about the second or third course, meaning the first course was in June in 1970. The second one was in September 1970, and I think we offered then 3 courses in corporate, real estate, and estates and trusts. And at that point, we had a good student turnout, a terrific quality, and within 6 months after that, we knew we were going to be fine.
yeah, I mean, as Dan said, in terms of, we've spread these students out all over the country. And my first job really was to get them jobs. And that first class, I know, I pounded the streets in Chicago, in San Francisco, in Seattle. There was a theme, by the way. Dan is older than I am. He was the president, so I reported to him. And he somehow managed to have all the warm weather cities, and I had all the cold weather cities, and we split New York. We split New York. I think I had Philadelphia and Washington. He had Miami. And we literally went all over the country to try to sell it. And my recollection is that the first class, it was, as he said, the schools closed down because Nixon bombed Cambodia, then Kent State happened, the schools all closed soon after we started. So we had a small class, luckily, because it took a Herculean effort to get them jobs. I think probably between us might have seen 25 New York law firms before just magically one of us was at Winthrop Stimson, and we were meeting with the senior partner in the corporate department, and he said, yeah, I'll try it. And it was like, I mean, whoever, I don't remember which of us got the job, but the first stop was a phone booth to call back to the office saying, you're not going to believe this. And then in sheer desperation, I was at Sherman and Sterling, which was the biggest firm in the country, meeting with the head of their corporate department. And after I had exhausted, you know, we had a really neat little economic study that showed why this was a good thing for the firm. And you know, they would look at it and say, that's interesting, but it wasn't going to make much difference to anybody's life at that moment. And I finally, out of desperation, said to him, I'm looking around here, and your overhead must be, and I don't remember the number then, it might have been $80 million, biggest firm in the world. And I said, we're asking you to hire one person for $8,500. When you include space and secretarial help and so forth, it'll cost you $13,000 a year. If it doesn't work, we refund your money. If you are unhappy with this person, we had a series of refunds. And if it does work, let's forget the money for a minute. Your young lawyers are going to be able to do things that are more appropriate for what they're being paid. And the guy looked at, I was just desperate. I had blown every argument. And the guy looked at me and said, okay. So now, you know, well, we've got 2 of the biggest firms in the country. And then Dan, I think, was doing Chicago and got Sidley and Austin. And I think Mayor Brown also still a very big firm, and then we go, all of a sudden Philadelphia, our firm, Wolf Block had agreed to hire someone, and Morgan Lewis had agreed to hire someone. So these 12 people ultimately landed in very, very prestigious firms.
Yeah.
And you know, we thought because the course was great, and it was great, it was very vocational, it was how to do certain, very specific things. But the other thing was we were putting into the law firm people that were intellectually equal to the young lawyers there, without question. And if you let people like that loose, they're going to find something to do that's useful. And by the third class, maybe, we were now able to walk into a firm that looked at us like we were nuts and say, why don't you call Hamilton Haddon IV? That was the guy at Sherman and Sterling. He had pictures in his office of himself on his polo pony with the Duke of Edinburgh, with a little inscription to my friend Hamilton. I mean, I felt so overwhelmed sitting in that office. And now you could say, call Hamilton Haddon at Sherman and Sterling and see what he thinks. And that started, and people were great. I mean, the people that tried it were always willing to talk to other lawyers and really to talk it up. And so slowly it started to move. But by no later than the second class, we figured we had exhausted corporate at that point, and we had to switch to estates. I was doing a terrible job of selling. I didn't know how to do it, and I was terrified to make the cold calls to get the meetings, and we kept switching jobs around. So I then was in charge of the estates course and putting it together and hiring outside people to help us write it, and I taught that whole course myself. And then the second summer, we added real estate and we added litigation. And we had young lawyers in the city, third, fourth, fifth year associates, many of them from Penn, that we knew from school, who were working in the big firms, who wrote chapters, we edited them, and who taught part-time at the school. We did a lot of the teaching early on, and then less and less over time.
We're talking about the early visits to law firms. One of the things we had going for us, we had these brochures with the pencil in the hair, but in the back of the brochure, it described the backgrounds of Paul and me and someone else who was with us, Richard Bramer, who worked part-time with us. And he had been at a Yale Law Journal, and so we had credentials of some sort that would mean something at a large law firm. And I remember going to, I'd never heard of them, the largest law firm in the world at the time, Baker and McKenzie.
That's right, they were bigger than Sherman.
And I walked in and I got a meeting with the managing partner of the largest law firm in the world that I had never heard of. And he said, this is really, really interesting. I'd like to hire you. And I said, no, I work there. I don't work here. And he said, no, you're wasting your time. This is silly. We'll take somebody, but this is silly. Come work with us.
Yeah, and I had lawyers who looked at that and said, you were at Wolf Block, Shore and Soles Cohn? Yes. It's a really good firm. I said, I know it is. Will they take you back? Because you need to go back there. This is not going to work. It was, and it went, I mean, it was a very tough sell at the beginning. There was one of the largest firms in Minneapolis, been around forever, was a firm named Fegre and Benson. And I was meeting with Mr. Fegre or Mr. Benson. I don't remember which. He was an old curmudgeon. And he listened to this story and he said, mark my words, young man, as long as I am alive, we will never have one of these paralegal things you're talking about. And I mean, we got a lot of that. And then we got all kinds of stuff.
Can I interrupt you with one
sure.
second? Because I remember you came back and you told me that, and Paul's line afterwards was, give me 1 year.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. And the stuff that went on was just, it was fascinating. We had to get these people jobs because we'd have to give them their money back otherwise. And so we did something that I think was unique, which was, and almost everything we did was, I mean, it was way over hashed. I mean, we were lawyers, so the discussions would go on and on and on and on before we would do something. And then a lot of it was just, we tried everything else, and it was desperation, which is typical, I think, of new businesses. But we had to teach our students how to do an interview. We couldn't risk them going out. We had very few places for them. And I remember, we had a student, it was the first student that was going to interview at Meseroff, Gelman, Jaffe, and then Levin, I think, became Kramer. And Paul Jaffe, who later became a judge, was going to interview her, and he wanted to take her to lunch at the Locust Club, which was a big eating club in Philadelphia. So we had a whole session, literally, on how do you do a lunch meeting, what do you eat? Because it's very, you don't eat a salad, you don't eat anything that's going to get in your teeth, you don't eat anything that needs cutting. And ultimately, one of the most interesting things is that I ended up spending time on the hiring committee at Wolf Block when I went back. And we used to talk about how interesting it was that young lawyers would come for interviews, and in reality, we all remembered this. I mean, they were eating something out of a can the night, for lunch the day before, and now we're taking them to a fancy restaurant. And so somebody would try to do an interview while eating a lobster with 3 lawyers, and some of it would end up on their lap. And what do you eat? So we did everything we could to get them ready for interviews, and we pre-interviewed every student with our staff, and they would be passed around until they passed an interview. And it was painful. Some of them were just, they couldn't look at somebody in the eye. They just didn't know how to handle it, and they got thrown a lot of curveballs. I mean, one of the things in the back of the mind of the lawyers in those days was, this is a young woman, she's bright, she's going to get married, she's going to get pregnant, we're going to lose her. And we had lawyers that asked them point blank, what birth control are you taking? I mean, this stuff is astounding. I mean, absolutely astounding when you look at it today. And we had to assure lawyers that no, they weren't there to get married, they weren't there to go to law school, etc. There was a lot of very interesting stuff going on in the world, and we sort of faced a lot of it.
I'm guessing that it was probably about 2.5 years down the road, something like that. And the competition came in a few different, there wasn't very much. A lot of people were talking about it, a lot of universities. And one, by the way, it's a little off the beaten path a little bit, but a story that it shocked me because of where we were coming from. This was in '73, I think, and the corporate hit a downturn because the economy went south, and corporate was real tough sell. And we had, 40 students who were taking the course, and we struggled and struggled and struggled and got almost all of them placed. And I was on the phone because somebody had been calling me. They wanted to start a program at a very famous West Coast law firm, university, big university. And they had a paralegal program in corporate. And that was all they had. And they had 40 graduates of the program. And I said, how did you do with them? He said, well, we're offering the course again in the fall. I said, yeah, another 40 people? Because we had cut it out. He said, yeah, probably another 40. I said, how did the placements go for the other 40? He said, about 5 of them got jobs. I just thought, how could you do that?
Yeah, it was actually, it was happening at the law schools too. Because what happened was we had the first, I guess it was the Iranian oil crisis. I remember it as Iran. They cut off oil to the United States. We had gas rationing. If you had an odd number on your license plate, you could get gas Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If you had an even number, it was Tuesday, Thursday, whatever. And the economy, everybody freaked out. The economy, it turned out lawyers did okay, but they freaked out. They stopped hiring, and they absolutely stopped on us. We had pre-commitments for everybody for every class we took. They weren't legally binding, but we knew that we had 4 jobs in Chicago. We knew what firms they were. They were pre-committed by then. And as Dan said, it was very difficult, and young lawyers were going through the same thing. And I remember around that time, we were invited to speak to the American Association of Law School Professors at the Waldorf. And for whatever reason, I ended up being the person to go there. And it was the first time I'd ever been at the Waldorf, and it was very exciting. And I'm sitting there in front of all these law school professors, and everything we did. The interesting thing was it was everybody we were interfacing with was way senior to us, both in terms of age and in terms of what we had done in life and where they were. And it was very much like today. Penn wasn't having trouble placing students, but there were a lot of other programs started because if you had a bare bones law program and you didn't have the kind of faculty that the top rate schools did and so forth, you could make a lot of money with a law school can make a lot of money for the rest of the university. And those schools were having enormous problems placing people. And I remember saying to the professors, we're a proprietary school. And we went through all kinds of issues with accreditation, with the states and so forth. And we guarantee our students a job within 2 months in the city they've designated. We are able to do it because we don't take them if we don't think we have the job. And we do have people that we have to give money back to. I mean, either we've misjudged something, somebody walks away from a commitment, or we have a student that just can't get through an interview, which we try to weed out in advance, but we're wrong. But we were placing well in the 90s within the 60 days. And if you looked at it on 120 days, it was almost full employment because we got jobs for people after the time they got their money back and got a job. And the law schools were not acting as reputably as we were. And it was very aggravating. They were very defensive. It was a very interesting experience at the time.
In terms of placement, Paul talked about the word of mouth after a while, but we travel. Paul and I would travel around with course materials, with big bags with course materials, and we'd plop them on somebody's desk and say, "This is what we're teaching them." It was very, very impressive. And then with that, after some period of time, a year and a half or so, we also had a list, which was pretty thick, of all the law firms that had hired our graduates in various courses. And people looked at that and they didn't want to be left out any longer. They wanted in. And of course, going back to your question, yeah, that invited some people to think this is a good business to get into. A lot of universities looked at it. Don't think very many started programs back in the early to mid 70s, a few. But everybody talked about it. I mean, I would get, every week or two, I would get a phone call from somebody at some university or some lawyer who asked me to talk to somebody at a university, and they were thinking about it, but mostly they didn't happen.
A lot of them came to visit us. Mm-hmm. A lot of them would come to the school to visit with us to see what was going on.
One for-profit program started in Chicago. It was started by an entrepreneur along with one of our graduates. Yeah, that hurt a little.
But the interesting thing is nobody else charged for placing the students. So, and we knew that was going to be an issue down the road. We had to have students that were so good that a law firm would say, I'll pay $1,800, it was a quarter of their salary basically in most cities, to hire someone from the Institute rather than training my own person or hiring from one of these other schools that, there were just a few that had popped up. And it was obviously going to be a problem. It was hard to deal with. But we were extraordinarily selective with students, partly because we had to get them jobs. I mean, it was the only way the business model worked. And it was interesting because probably by 1973, the poster that we put up in college placement offices described what we were doing, what we were looking for, and said, do not apply without a B average. Whatever school you were at, you had to have a 3.0 average on a 4-point scale. And we would go on campus. We had a group that went on campus and interviewed. I think at our peak, like 80 colleges coast to coast.
I think 100.
Was it 100? Yeah, it was a lot, coast to coast. It was a full-time deal running around doing that. And we had our own exam that they had to take. And essentially, probably in 1973, as an example, when we pretty much hit our peak, we were taking 1 out of 7 qualified students who had applied to the school. And it was possible that the same person, had they been asking for Los Angeles and had a tie to Los Angeles so that a firm would buy that they weren't just there to, to hang out in Hollywood for a year, could have gotten in there but couldn't get in if he or it was a she almost always was applying for Chicago. And it was very funny because a lot of lawyers in major firms where we were placing people would call up outraged. My daughter got rejected at your school. She could get into a law school. And we'd say, we understand, but it's the way it is. And some of them called for their clients' kids. I mean, and some who are very famous alumni of this place and were former partners of ours leaned very heavily on us. And we really were very good about just saying no. And Dan, the line Dan came up with was, I remember this, was, if I take your daughter, then the person I send to you to hire, instead of thinking that she's qualified, you're going to wonder whose daughter she is. And we stuck to our guns on it. It was hard.
The funniest phone call I got was from a lawyer who was at a large firm in Philadelphia, and he was calling on behalf of a senior partner in that firm who was truly a famous lawyer. And he said, Bill, who was this famous lawyer, represents Pan American Airlines. And he said, and the president of Pan American Airlines has a daughter, and she would like to come to your school. And I said, that's wonderful to have her apply. Well, she did apply, but there's a problem apparently. And I said, well, I'll look into it, but I can't, of course, promise you anything, and only that it will be looked at carefully. And he said, no, you're not getting my message. And I said, I think I am, but he said, no. Let me tell you what I'm really saying. Can you imagine what it would be like to go to India in a Pan American flight and be greeted at the, you don't have to go through customs or anything like that. There'll be a car waiting for you with a driver to take you to a beautiful hotel, and blah, blah. Went on and on and on. I said, geez, that's amazing. You would do all that? He said, it can all be done. I said, it's a great story, but it's not going to get her anywhere.
Yeah, it was. It's tough when you're struggling, which to a degree we were early on, to to keep a business model in place. Actually, one thing we did develop, and it turned out when I look back on it to be sort of cute, was there were some places where companies in particular called us up and said, we've read about this and we have somebody we'd like to send to the school. Could we do that? And so we developed a model. Yes, you can. We still want to make sure the person's qualified for the program, but they have a job already. They're going back to that job. We're not getting a placement fee. We charged more tuition, and we did some of that. So some of the times when a lawyer like that would call, we would say, look, we can take the person if you've got a job for them. And some of them said, okay. And I guess one of the stories I love is because I think most people here know Steve Cozen. Steve sent his dad, who was Dan's basketball coach at Overbrook High, to the school. And his dad became a paralegal in Steve's firm. Well, strangely enough, the first year we were in business, when we really were struggling and we essentially had to go out and raise more money to keep going, we were approached. At the same time we were raising more money, there were two New York Stock Exchange companies in the United States that owned for-profit schools. One was CBS, which is now it's no longer Viacom, but the entertainment company, which was essentially television at that time. And the other was a company called Bell and Howell, which did a variety of things, but at the time was most famous for making movie cameras that used film, which I guess nobody here looking at this will understand. We were approached by CBS, which had a proprietary school division, to buy us. And it was very strange because we were, on the one hand, trying to raise money, on the other hand, talking to these people about buying us. And over the next couple of, it didn't work out, and over the next couple of years, we started to grow and take off, and we were secure financially. But we had a lot of other ideas and we didn't have the money to execute them. And in early 1973, we were approached by Bell and Howell. And Bell and Howell had a general counsel who was probably their number 3 officer, who had formerly been a partner at a large law firm in Chicago. And he was intrigued by this business model, and they owned a proprietary school, trade and technical school called the DeVry Institute of Technology, which is now a huge private proprietary school, which got spun off from Bell and Howell eventually. And they were very intrigued by the fact that here was a proprietary school that used, as students, college graduates, as opposed to what they had at DeVry, and wondered if there were other things that we could do, like, again, para somethings for medicine, for accountants, for other things. And they approached us and talked to us, and by April of 1973, which was 3 years after we had started, we sold the business to Bell and Howell. Although we remained in Philadelphia and we were standalone and did our own thing. And one of the reasons we were intrigued to do it, aside from the fact that we were going to make some money for ourselves and for our investors, was that we had ideas about other things we could do, and we didn't have the wherewithal to finance them. And we thought competition was coming, and it would be a good idea to be under the umbrella of somebody larger. And there were really 2 things we were working on at the time that were exciting, I thought. And one was, now the associates were coming into the firms, and they had a Penn Law degree and a Penn Law experience, but they didn't know how to do anything practical in the law firm. And they were expensive, and you couldn't train them the way Dan and I were trained. We spent 2 years rotating through departments. Nobody really cared very much if you billed time. You were, as Dan said, an apprentice. Our training materials and our courses were perfect, really, to train them on how to do stuff, which had nothing to do with, it was a good thing to have in addition to the Penn Law education. And we thought we could develop courses for the students that could be, that sold to the firms to do their own training internally. And the second thing was, states were starting to have talk about mandatory continuing legal education. There was very little of it at the time. And there were 2 or 3 major organizations who are still around doing continuing legal education, one being ALI, which was right off the campus here, American Law Institute, one being PLI, which was privately owned, and which I think is still around, and one being the New York Law Journal, which had a pretty big program. And we thought that that would be an interesting business for us to get into, and there were a whole lot of ideas that we had. You could put together a panel of the leading experts in antitrust law, and when the Supreme Court comes down with a major antitrust case, you would fly this six leading experts into a studio somewhere, and they would, before anybody could publish anything, they would talk about what they thought the implications of this were. And Bell and Howell was in the VCR business, probably in Beta, which died.
Right. Right.
And you would have a Beta network around the country, and you'd ship this stuff out to the law firms. The thing we had going for us that was a unique niche was we were, without question, the only company in the world that was marketing directly to the senior partners of law firms. We didn't go through the administrative group. The computer stuff, the telephone stuff, all that went through somebody that was in the administrative end of the law firm. We marketed directly to the department heads. So we had to go to the head of the corporate department, convince him to hire our graduates. So we were, this was unique. And what else could we market to those same people that had something to do with where our expertise was? So we sold out in '73. I think you left a year later.
Yeah.
Dan went off to write the great American novel.
Yeah.
Which he did. And I left, I actually tried to buy the business back from Bell and Howell I started in late 1975 and gave up finally in 1976, and decided that I was at a point where I didn't think I could learn anything more from it, and I had to do something else. So I resigned in the middle of 1976. And I stayed in touch with it by being involved in by then the American Bar Association was accrediting, certificating, I don't remember what it was called, but it was essentially an accreditation process, legal assistance, and I got involved in that and ultimately became head of the committee that did that. And I did that through I don't know, the mid-'80s maybe, and then lost touch.
And the institute, I guess, it folded in early 90s?
Well, they ultimately did sell it. And
Yeah.
the guy that bought it ran it till I guess the mid-'80s. The problem was the business model ultimately was doomed because of the placement fee. You just couldn't get the placement fee. There were too many schools by that time doing it for free, and your students no longer, they were all becoming lawyers and doctors and MBAs. So it was a different group of people becoming paralegals, and you just couldn't justify charging $1,800 to a firm. And I guess they never figured out the model for mass teaching, which is what you had to do. We were always referred to, and I hate to say this in a Penn situation, as the Harvard of paralegal schools. That's how the profession would refer to us. And then there were these other people, but there wasn't any room really for a Harvard anymore. The business model just simply didn't really work the way that it was done.
I think that they ultimately went to a straight tuition model, and I think they did okay. But then what happened was the school was sold still another time, and someone bought it who lived in Washington and spent very little time on it. It was an investment. He had somebody manage it for him, and it looked doomed. As I was visiting it one time, my sense was this is not going to last.
Another thing about the business model that I think is interesting is, as we started to grow, we realized that the two of us could not cover the whole country in a sales aspect, and who are we going to get that can tell the story the way we told it, and we decided to hire some of our brightest graduates. And then the same thing was happening on the college recruiting end. And so we went from 4 or 5 of us ultimately to a much larger group, and we hired what we thought were our best graduates out of several of the classes. And some of them worked in the placement end with Dan and me, which was very interesting because after they were trained, which was hard to do, it took a long time, they could walk into a law firm and in effect say, you're going to hire me. I'm the person you will get. And the people we chose were people you would want working for you. And then the same thing was going on the student side of it. And we ultimately hired a woman named Carolyn Layden, who she was a very, very bright Harvard Law School graduate who had worked as general counsel of the Philadelphia school system, and she became sort of our dean. And she would hire, we had about 50 people that taught for us at that point. Almost all of them part-time. They would come in and teach for a week or two, half a day, in something that they specialized in. And Carolyn became in charge of all of that. And Dan and I essentially got to the point where, for the most part, we split the placement, again, around the country with our staffs. And Dan he was in charge of the business end of it. He was the only one that understood accounting. I had no idea. He would sit in his office at night running all these numbers. I had no idea what he was doing because I'd never taken anything other than Accounting 101. It was a unique and exciting experience.
Well, Paul and I have spent a fair amount of time very recently looking at some materials, talking about this, and I think for most of the law profession is going to change. There's going to be a radical change. I don't know whether it's going to be in 5 or 10 years, but it will happen, and I think it will. I don't know that it's the most promising area for young lawyers today as it was back in the day. I think some people obviously will come through this, but it's going to be harder to get jobs. It's going to be, I think it's going to be more mechanized. there will be much more work that people. Well, it's funny. One of the things that our graduates used to do, I did when I was rotating through the litigation department, digest depositions. Well, I mean, then our paralegals started digesting depositions, saved huge amounts of lawyer time. So the same work could be done less expensively. Excuse me. And now you don't digest a deposition. It's all electronic. You're looking for a word somewhere? Sure, just tell us the word, and we can find it.
And it's outsourced where it's not. I mean, it's outsourced. If lawyers are touching it, you know, and I've seen some of these. It's a giant room with a bunch of desks with computers, and lawyers being paid much less than a graduate at Penn would want to come in, or work from home, or do both, and sit and work on the digesting of depositions. The problem is that the cost structure doesn't work anymore for most clients. The existing business model of the large law firms is just simply too expensive, and it's starting to be eroded. And I think that, personally, I think that 25 or 50 of the largest firms will be able to keep their business model largely intact and survive. And you know, it's 10 or 12 in New York and several in Chicago, you know, and it's going to be spread around the country because people are going to decide they'll pay whatever it takes to use those firms, and their model will say somewhat similar. But I think for the rest of the profession, it's going to be very, very different. And one of the things that makes it obvious to me is the introduction of paralegals is the last major change in the practice of law that occurred from a business standpoint, and it occurred 43 years ago it started to. There's nothing else in the world that hasn't changed dramatically in 43 years. So it almost, just from that analysis alone, it will change. And I think what's going to happen is that there are going to be many fewer lawyers needed. I don't know how young lawyers are going to get trained, because I'm not sure that many of the firms will hire the way they do today. And again, I would be less concerned if I was graduating from a top-tier law school, from a Penn, but I think that people that are coming out of everything from 20 on are going to have enormous problems. And I think what's going to happen, hopefully what will happen is, we'll develop models that will enable us to use lawyers and at a reasonable economic model service the middle class and people that are below middle class who have legal problems with clinics and so forth at a much greater level than we do now, and find jobs that are meaningful for lawyers. They won't make the kind of money that they would make at a Wall Street firm, but they may make a decent living. That may happen. But I think the large law firm model is going to undergo an enormous change. I can't quite figure out how it's going to work, or we would have opened the business by now, but it's going to change.